Right, welcome everybody to the last day before the to the last talk, not day, before the coffee break, and we're going to talk about Django. Django is one of the largest web frameworks in Python, and Daniel is going to discuss if Django is maybe too complex for its own good. Please make him feel very welcome by a large round of applause.
Thanks, everyone. So in the web development world, there are two major approaches. On one side, you have micro-frameworks like Flask, and on the other hand, you have big frameworks, or another term which I really like is batteries included frameworks like Django. So can I get a quick show of hands? Who here is team micro-framework? Yeah, okay, that's a couple. And who is rather on the batteries included side? Yeah, that's a friendly crowd today, I guess. So yeah, as Tobias announced, in the next 20 minutes, I want to explore the questions if, with all these batteries included, maybe Django is in fact too complicated. First, a few words about me. So my name is Daniel Hepper. I live in Cologne, Germany, and I work as an independent software developer and consultant. And I've been freelancing now for a bit more than 8 years, so if you're interested in freelancing and that kind of stuff, feel free to catch me. I'll be around tomorrow. And yeah, so I've been dabbling with Django since the pre-1.0 days, and I've got more serious in using it since I became a freelancer. And I've worked in all different kinds of clients, different industries, different sizes, ranging from small SaaS startups to bigger companies, more traditional companies like a book publisher, which I'll talk a bit about later. But before we get into it, I have to give you a word of warning. With my background, I'm maybe a slightly bit biased towards Django. So this talk's going to be a slippery slope of personal opinions and anecdotal evidence. So take everything with a grain of salt. But I tried to be open-minded about it, and as it turns out, even learned a few things. So I will draw a lot of comparisons between Flask and Django, also from my personal experience. But this is not supposed to be a Django versus Flask task. And you should not go out of this task and say, oh, I never use Flask again, or no, I'll everything Django from now on. It's just when you make a next technical decision, it maybe gives you a couple of more factors to consider or arguments to convince your colleagues. So why would anyone get the idea that Django is too complicated in the first place? I have an idea or a theory which I want to illustrate by building the canonical Hello World app. So let's build a Django app. First step is to install Django in a virtual env, pip install Django. There we go. The second step is to create a project. We have a management command for that, Django admin start project, hello world, easy. Now we create an app, and that's where maybe someone new to that whole thing becomes a bit confused, like, what's the difference between a project and an app? So that's kind of historical, because what you would call a project in Django, or what you call a project in Django, you would probably call an app in the rest of the world. And what you call an app is more like a module. So then you say, OK, I'm going to start my app. You call it Hello World. Not so quick, because that name already exists. So step 2.A is come up with a name for your app. So what do you call your app? You call it core or app or main. Let's go with main. OK, that worked. Now we can explore the code that Django helpfully generated for us. Yeah, it's not too bad. A couple of directories, few files. So let's have a look at settings. OK, yeah, settings. So these are quick start development settings, unsuitable for production. All right. Here we have a security warning and application definitions and sessions and content types and middlewares and CSRF middleware, X-frame options, templates. What? What's all that stuff? And that might be the point where you just throw up your hands and say, OK, step 4, I just use Flask. So I write my 6 lines of code and I'm done. But this might seem slightly over-exaggerated, but if you go to a place like the Python subreddit or something like that, there are many examples where people struggle with the Django problem, and someone else steps in, tries to be helpful, and says, yeah, I had the same problem. In the end, I just did it in Flask. It was really simple. But let's step back for a second and put on our philosopher hat and think what it means that something is complicated. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, complicated means involving a lot of different parts in a way that is difficult to understand. So what's a lot of different parts in the context of a web framework? Maybe lines of code, right? So how does Django compare to Flask in terms of lines of code? That's not too bad. So yesterday, Marco gave a great talk titled Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. And we learned some neat tricks there. Like, for example, if you don't like how a diagram looks, you just use the right scale. Like in this example, a logarithmic scale is really favorable because in reality, it's a different picture. So I don't know, Django has 77,000 lines of code, not including tests, while Flask has 3,300. And I don't know if 77,000 is a lot, but it's definitely a lot more than 3,300. So what about the second part of the definition? Difficult to understand. So you might have looked at my entry slide and wondered what this thing is. It's not some abstract art that I came up with. It's actually part of the dependency graph of Django. And if you zoom out a bit, and if you compare that to Flask, well, obviously it's a comparison of apples to oranges. Naturally, Django comes with a lot more code because it has a lot more features. And furthermore, Django is mostly self-contained, while Flask relies on a bunch of third-party packages, even for its core functionalities. So, for example, Werkzeug and Jinja come installed with Flask by default. And if you're using a database, you probably want to use SQL Alchemy, which itself is a rather big package. So who wants to guess how many lines of code SQL Alchemy has? So there are no tricks this time. In fact, SQL Alchemy has exactly the same 77,000 lines of code as Django has. So you have all these features in Django, but that doesn't mean that you have to use them. So let's go back to our Hello World example. What do you really need for Hello World? You need a view that turns an HTTP request in an HTTP response. You need some way to connect the URL to that view. That's done with URL patterns in Django. And then you need a few settings. So the only setting you really need is the root URL conf, and the rest is kind of boilerplate. And that's about it. And if you want to get really fancy, you can put all that in a single file. And I'm not brave enough to live demo that, but you can trust me that this works as intended, and it prints the hello world. But you don't get to benefit of all the great features that Django has to offer with this minimal settings file. You don't get user authentication. You don't get an admin interface. You don't get templates. You don't get an ORM, which some people might think is a good thing. But if you just want some URL routing and a reasonable interface to access your HTTP request, you're already good to go. Naturally, that single file approach only goes so far. You also don't get any structure. And this whole project app thing is probably a bit dated, but it forces you to think about modularizing your code right from the beginning. And our Hello World example, although it might seem, or it is quite academic, and you're definitely not going to raise any venture capital with it, it is somewhat realistic and relevant because you might build a REST API where you just have token authentication and no sessions and no server-side rendering and you really don't need all the features that Django provides. So you can either start with a blank settings file and just add the features you really want to use, or you remove the stuff you don't need. But then you might argue, okay, then I have all that cruft lying around and gathering dust. And my hypothesis was, yeah, it's not used, but it's just a few megabytes of disk space, and that doesn't really make a difference these days. To prove my point, I've written a little script or module that prints out all imports, and then I ran my Hello World example and compared the number to the total number of modules in Django. And to my surprise, even for that minimal Hello World example, Django imported a third of all the modules it had, or more than a third. But I don't have a fancy graph for that, but the thing is, the memory usage is in fact the same after it handled the first request between that minimal Flask app and that minimal Hello World app, so yeah. So what about that humongous settings file? I'd say with great power comes great verbosity, and this settings file is, in my opinion, a good example of explicit is better than implicit. Of course, you could hide all that in some default settings file somewhere that you have to override, but spelling it out explicitly gives you an opportunity to know what's going on. And for a classical MVC CRUD application, these defaults are still quite sensible. It could probably be, or to be really production ready, it would probably need to be even more complicated because you have things like different environments and proper handling of your secrets. But there you have to take the balance. Do you want to make it even more complicated for a beginner, or do you tailor it to some really specific need, which is really for only really specific use cases? So why not start with a blank slate? Why not say, okay, you have to add a bunch of, here's an empty settings file, and just add the stuff you need. In my opinion, a personal opinion, a better is included framework has some kind of responsibility to provide safe defaults and protect users from unknowns. To illustrate what I mean, let's talk about CSRF real quick. So CSRF is a vulnerability that basically affects, or potentially affects, every web application that uses cookie-based authentication. And Django comes with mechanisms to protect against CSRF, and they are enabled by default in the settings file, which is generated with the start project command. And it's a never-ending source of frustration for beginners, because you have to remember certain things, like adding a token to your, or a token tag to your forms in your templates. If you want to do JavaScript, you have to mess with the request headers and all that kind of stuff. But there's no easy solution for that. It's really a catch-22, because the very beginner who struggles with getting their forms to work doesn't even know that CSRF is a thing. And with this default settings file, although it might stand in the way of getting something to work quickly, protects the user from shooting themselves in the foot. That being said, I think a framework shouldn't make it too hard to shoot yourself in the foot, but it should probably not be the default. In that sense, a framework can serve as a guardrail for security issues and for many other decisions you have to make. Like in Django, if you want to use an ORM, it's pretty much a no-brainer to use the Django ORM, because it fits nicely into everything else. So now you might argue it prevents you from using the right tool for the job. But let's be honest, how do you evaluate the right tool for the job? Do you have really objective measures, or is it more a matter of personal taste, or just Googling Flask form library and using the first thing that comes up? From my, to be honest, rather limited experience with Flask, my feeling is that the ecosystem has one clear winner anyway. You want forms, you use WT forms. You want an ORM, you use SQL Alchemy. You want migrations, you use Alembic, and so on. So what you're aiming for is to have the best of breed for your application, but what you end up is either the general consensus or your cocktail of personal taste with just a dash of premature optimization. So, because there's another thing to consider, it's not just the functional aspects of your application, but also maintenance and mental overhead for yourself and for your teammates if you're working in a team. Let me tell you a story of my experience at the book publisher I mentioned earlier. So this book publisher runs 2 web shops written in Django with the Oscar shop framework, and they're selling, besides books, they also sell digital products like ebooks. And a while ago, the EU changed how VAT is applied. Previously, so VAT, previously it was applied according to the, or the rate was chosen according to the seller's country, which was abused by Amazon by registering in Luxembourg and paying almost no VAT on digital products. While, for example, if you're a German company, you have to pay 19% VAT. So the EU has said, yeah, great idea. You have to charge VAT according of the country of your buyer, which means that we had to get all the EU VAT rates somehow in our application to calculate the correct amount of VAT. So the easy solution would probably have been to create a small package, which essentially is just a dictionary. But instead, of course, we built a microservice. And as I said, this was a Django shop, but because it's a microservice, it's allocated, Django is way too big for this small service, so let's build it in Flask. But as it turned out, it wasn't that small. You want to store the stuff in a database, so you need SQL Alchemy, and then you need migrations, and then you do want Alembic. And in the end, it still was not a big application. It was a few hundred lines of code. But the whole stack was different from what we were used to. And it was developed by one developer, and as things go, this developer left the company 3 weeks after finishing the project. And now we're left with this application. And it ran along fine. And after, I don't know, a couple of months, we had to do a small change, and then you're sitting there and you have to learn a completely new stack without any upside. It would have made absolutely no difference to develop this application in Django. Or it would have had absolutely no downside to do this application and keep our ecosystem completely homogeneous. So this monoculture of one common stack really reduces developer or mental overhead for the developers. Also, I think with a microframework, you have a bit of a tendency to build stuff yourself. So there's a spectrum between not invented here syndrome and religiously worshipping any package you find on PyPy, even if it has only 7 stars on GitHub. But I have a story which clearly falls on one side of that spectrum. So back when I was still employed, it was one evening, it was late in the evening, and besides me there was only a junior developer left in the office. So I went over to give him a bit of motivation. I thought, yeah, what are you working on? He said, yeah, I'm struggling with that problem. I'm trying to implement a way to generate secure tokens for password resets. Let that sink in for a moment. So you have that junior developer running on stale coffee, implementing password reset tokens. I'm sure there are problems which deserve a custom solution, but password reset tokens is definitely not one of them. People have solved this problem before. They might not necessarily be smarter than you, but their solution is probably pretty battle-tested. So, yeah, I think we should think twice before we reinvent the wheel, basically. So, let's talk about documentation again for a moment. So, Django is known for having great documentation. I think there are no undocumented parts in Django, which as a consequence, because Django is a big framework, means that the documentation is vast. If you want to read the documentation from beginning to the end, you will have a lot of reading to do. So a beginner can be overwhelmed by the volume of documentation, but you don't really need to read everything. Just like you wouldn't enter a library and say, okay, I'm going to start at A and I'm not going to leave before I'm done with Z. You just pick out the bits you need. Maybe Django doesn't do the best job to tell you which parts are really relevant for you. I don't know, because there's no librarian who tells you where to look. But still, yeah, I don't know how this can be made more accessible for beginners. But in the end, even despite that scary, hairy dependency graph, many parts of Django don't require advanced Python knowledge to just dive into the code and have a look around what's going on under the hood. So what's the final verdict? Is Django too complicated? I think we can all agree on that Django has many parts, and it may take a while to wrap your head around all of them. But in the process, Django might solve problems, or you might come across solutions for problems that you weren't even aware of that you had them. Also, Django is tightly integrated, which means the more parts of Django you use, the more you benefit, and vice versa, the less you use, the less you benefit compared to another framework. And you can definitely only use select parts. You don't have to use everything. It gets a bit tricky once you want to swap out parts. In fact, I would go so far and say Django could be even simpler and more powerful if it was more opinionated about the way of doing things. Imagine Django would only support Postgres. All the generic SQL code could go away, and you could use all the power of PostgreSQL. And finally, whenever you make a technical decision, look beyond your current project, because it's not just the project might be finished, or you might hand it off to the next person. But if you're working in a larger organization, in a larger team, think about the impact it has on everyone else. And last but not least, in my experience, or what I'm relatively active in Stack Overflow, so where I see many people struggle is the bits where Django has no opinion, where you have the most freedom. People, especially beginners, tend to struggle the most. Like, for example, deployment is a big topic where Django doesn't really help you, and many people, they are finished with their tutorial and finally want to deploy, and then they are hitting a wall. So yeah, probably once you saw my background, you probably knew my answer to the question if Django is too complicated. I don't know if it makes sense to further discuss it in this round, but I'm happy to, if you have any comments, please approach me during the breaks or tomorrow, and we'll take it from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm afraid we're slightly out of time for questions, and since this is a very opinionated topic, I'm sure many of you will have more of a comment than a question, really. But Daniel will be around, so please approach him and continue this conversation either with questions or comments in private. We are now breaking for the coffee break, and so you will have about half an hour to do that directly, and after that you can come back here to find out everything about being a manager. Thank you.